As someone who's been a fan of Japanese games and has been getting more and more into JRPGs in recent years, Final Fantasy was a series that I was always curious about but had never really dipped my toes into. The extent of my knowledge stemmed from random YouTube videos and the embarrassing amount of Kingdom Hearts that I played as a kid, and as a teenager, and as an adult. Don't get hit.
Hey, no cutting.
Here it is. But anyway, over the years, I had attempted to get into the Final Fantasy series multiple times to no avail. I got 13 used at a GameStop for $5, and I still felt ripped off after playing it. I played half of 10. I really liked it, but I never finished it. I'd started Final Fantasy 15. I got bored pretty quickly on, dropped it. And then I trudged my way through Final Fantasy XIV's A Realm Reborn over the course of about a year, and hated pretty much everything involved with it, myself included for having played it. Needless to say, not the best track record, but it always bugged me that I never finished any of the games. With the lead up to 16 releasing, I was hyped, and I felt that it was finally time to give these games a second chance. But this time, to start from the beginning. I was going to play Final Fantasy 1, work my way through all the games until I got to 16. I was going to play that game on launch, but as you can see, that didn't happen. Well, after finishing that game, I have now completed every mainline Final Fantasy game.
With a few exceptions, but I'll get to those.
For these playthroughs, I chose what I deemed was the best overall version of each game and used speed-ups, save states, and walkthroughs wherever I deemed necessary, because I wanted to get the best possible experience and to encounter as much of each game as I could, really diving deep and appreciating what the poster child of turn-based games and JRPGs as a whole had to offer over the course of nearly its 40 years of history. A brief disclaimer that I want to put out is that I didn't record footage when I had initially played these games because I'm really smart and I like to make more work for myself. So my footage here is often using cheats and other boosts so that I can breeze through the games quicker and record certain spots. I didn't use any of that when I played the game. I only used like speed ups and save states. I didn't use XP boosts or any of the sort. And with that out of the way, let's get right into talking about Final Fantasy for the NES. The original Final Fantasy is a weird game. Dragon Quest I had only recently been released at the time, and there really wasn't an existing model for what a turn-based JRPG was yet, so Final Fantasy doesn't adhere to modern standards, and it feels more like a proof of concept at times. For this game, I played the PSP remake. I really liked the visuals in it, and I was able to use save states as needed and turbo speed. It really helped with the experience here. You press start, pick your classes, name your characters, and you're immediately dropped into a field next to a town and a large castle. No direction on what to do at all. Complete freedom is in the player's hands at this point. Well, not really, as you only have a small island of explorable land accessible at the moment, but it has enough to get the player started. The town has shops in it where the player can buy items and equipment. There's weak enemies all around the surrounding areas, and they all have 1 HP to teach the player the combat system without being too overwhelming. There's areas you can't proceed through yet, and the actual destination. This sets a pretty good vertical slice for the game, demonstrating nearly every component that the game will have to offer in a controlled environment, quickly attuning players with what to expect from the game going forward. Go into the castle, and you're given your quest from the king to go save the princess from the big bad Garland. The story's pretty effective. It's just a basic heroes go stop the bad guy plot. It does its job in establishing a motive and sends the player on their way without wasting any time. Make your way up to the Chaos Shrine and face Garland. He dies like really easily, and you save the princess. Quest over! Okay, actually, you now have a new quest to go save the 4 crystals of the elements from the evil Chaos, a new villain that showed up. The king has the nearby bridge rebuilt, and the hero party continues on a new journey, going all across the world to find these crystals. As far as introductions go, I think this is great, and I think it's the single strongest part of the game by far. Obviously, with my prior knowledge of the genre, a lot of the things that it was teaching me are pretty obvious and I already knew them, But the design of the game here is perfect when you put it in the perspective of someone from 1987 playing this, having never before seen this kind of genre. There's no need for direct tutorials when the game is designed well enough to teach you as you go. By the time you venture out into the rest of the map, the player should have the basics of the game down. Looking at the gameplay is where Final Fantasy really becomes the mixed bag that it is. It's your traditional XP system, beat up enemies, level up, get stronger to fight stronger enemies. The core gameplay is actually fairly decent, and it feels alright to play. The level design is probably the game's biggest issue. Dungeons are often wide open with tons of dead ends, having little to actually do or interact with besides fighting random mobs. Chests are placed in the weirdest method I've ever seen in a game, often putting like 6+ chests in the same room and nothing for the rest of the floor of the dungeon. A lot of things are just broken by modern standards, but that makes it kind of fun in a way. Thieves are basically useless for the entire game, and knights are so broken that even enemies with physical resistance just kind of get demolished by them, so running full knights is like totally plausible. The broken stuff that I don't like, however, far outweighs the positive. Some bosses are set to spawn on specific tiles instead of being single encounters, so you can accidentally fight them over and over and over again, and this happens a lot, and it just sucks. The environments tend to have a lot of one-tile-wide paths, and NPCs do everything in their power to refuse you access to everything at any opportunity. The walkthrough guide was extremely important to getting through this game for me because the story direction makes no sense most of the time and is rarely tied to just beating a dungeon like it would be in a modern game. Oftentimes you have to find a specific key item in a random chest in a dungeon, or it'll make you go to some random other location to progress the quest. One of the worst examples of this unclear direction is getting to the Sunken Shrine dungeon. The path goes like this. After getting the airship, fly to this random desert with nothing nearby, land nearby, and walk all the way to this single tile here to find a hidden caravan. Inside is a merchant that sells a fairy bottle for 40,000 gil. Purchase this, take it to Gaia, which is just another regular town, and the fairy escapes to a hidden lake in the back of the town. Find her there, and she gifts you with the oxale, or however you pronounce that, granting your party the ability to breathe underwater. Once you do all of this, make your way to the docks of Onrak, which is another town, and enter the shrine. None of this makes any sense, nor does it give you any indication of what to do or where to go next. Why would you walk on this specific desert tile to find the caravan? Why would you think to take the ferry specifically to Gaia? It's just a confusing fetch quest with too many layers. If this was all optional side content, this wouldn't be as bad, but having it required for main story progression is just obtuse and confusing. The real kicker with this is that instead of just completing the Sunken Shrine by beating the boss and moving on, the key item you need to progress there after that is hidden in a random chest off the main path. Forgot to get this, or you didn't even know it was there? Go through the entire dungeon again and grab it, stupid. Too much of Final Fantasy almost requires the player to have prior knowledge of the game, or else they'll have to comb every single tile in the world to potentially find the path to progression. This general game design just gets more and more annoying and makes the game more and more tedious as it goes on, resulting in the game getting worse and worse until it's just a slog to play through. See if you notice this trend going forward for the series, because it will come back. Despite all the negatives that I bring up, I really want to mention and highlight the visuals of the game, because this game looks great, especially for the PSP remake. I love all the enemy sprites, the character sprites look pretty good, the bosses look awesome especially, and I really like the dungeon variation. There's like caves, there's swamps, there's an ice dungeon, a lava dungeon. It really makes the adventure feel that much more special, and even though going through these dungeons sucks, everything feels a little bit better when it looks cool. The end of the game is actually pretty cool. The party returns to the Chaos Shrine from the beginning of the game. Having restored the 4 crystals now, they use their powers to go back in time 2,000 years to stop Chaos in his tracks. You go through a fairly straightforward dungeon, fighting the 4 major fiend bosses again, confront Garland, who is possessed by Chaos, defeat him, and sever the time loop that was apparently happening but was never really talked about in the story anywhere up until this point. The Warriors of Light return peace to the land, and the credits roll. Simple and effective right to the end. Despite all the negatives that I bring up, I think Final Fantasy is still a really interesting game. If you like JRPGs, I definitely recommend playing this game at least once. If you've played a turn-based RPG before, you've played pretty much everything Final Fantasy I has to offer from a gameplay perspective, though seeing the origin of all those trends is really interesting. There really isn't much else to say about the game other than that it's just a cool piece of history for video games. Garland is a really cool villain though, I like him a lot. I kind of hope they make a spin-off prequel that's really stupid but awesome 35 years later. That would be cool.
I don't give a fuck who you are! Bullshit.
Final Fantasy II is a universally hated game, and you're not going to hear anything different here. This game took a heavier focus on story and role-playing, as there's a lot more exploring, talking to people, and a generally more in-depth plot. Unfortunately, this doesn't really go anywhere because the writing isn't very good, but it's worth mentioning, as it is a noticeable change from the first game. Just like with FF1, for this game I chose the PSP remake for its visuals, gameplay touch-ups, and emulator boosts. The story begins with war, as the Emperor of the Kingdom of Palamecia has summoned monsters from the underworld and is using their power for world domination. A rebel group was formed in the neighboring Kingdom of Fynn to fight back against this conquest, but they were quickly defeated. The story then cuts to a group of youths who had lost their families to the Empire's onslaught, attempting to escape the attack of their troops, and the player is dropped into battle immediately. Obviously unwinnable, the young group are defeated and left to die, luckily being found by some of the remaining rebel forces and were taken back to their hideout to recover. With one member of the group missing, the three remaining protagonists then request to join the rebel group to get back at the Empire and to find their missing friend. In a very similar fashion to what made the first game's plot effective, Final Fantasy II does a great job at quickly establishing a simple yet effective story and a strong drive for the player to want to move forward. Having the first actions the player do be an unwinnable battle quickly drives home how powerful the Empire is and how insurmountable the challenge that the hero group has put upon themselves is. This start has a lot more of an emotional pull than its predecessor, and I like it a lot. Having a dedicated party of characters makes you able to empathize with them more, and it allows the writers to create more dialogue and scenarios that are a bit more unique to the characters themselves. The game rarely uses this, but it's still a nice change of pace from the four non-characters you have in the first game. Firion and his ragtag group of wet paper towels that just kind of sit there 90% of the time are okay. Firion is your noble hero type guy, Maria cries about her missing brother Leon every 20 minutes, and Guy is... They never really annoy you or do anything cool because they're just kind of there, barely doing anything for the entire course of the game, but they're worth mentioning. You only get 3 mainstay characters, as your fourth party member always either dies in 5 minutes or completely screws off somewhere else for the rest of the game because of some plot convenience that they make up. You get used to this pretty quickly, and it honestly encourages you to see what other stats do, as these temporary members often specialize in different areas. The Emperor as a villain is nothing special, he's just kind of a generic evil Emperor man who is evil and bad and evil. I wouldn't say he's a bad villain, but whatever kind of character you're picturing in your head right now is probably very close to his actual personality. Him dying and coming back from hell is absolutely raw though, so I gotta give respect where it's due. As many of you probably already know, this sequel did away with the XP and leveling system that was established by the first game, opting instead that the player gain experience by directly using the stats they want to upgrade. Use a sword to level up swords, use fire magic to level fire magic, etc, etc. I honestly didn't have much trouble with this, as I chose the stats I wanted each character to excel at in the beginning, and stuck with them for pretty much the whole game. Spend 30 minutes just grinding outside the starting town, beating up both goblins and your own party, and you'll have progressed enough to handle your next few tasks, leveling up much more naturally along the way. This system would have been fine if HP and MP weren't tied to it as well. Having to take damage to level up HP and use magic to raise the MP cap is entirely tedious and kind of ruins the experience overall. Making it a regular XP level system for these two core stats would have fixed this system and made the combat a lot less annoying. I honestly did find the leveling system kind of fun early on. Levels are fairly fast and you get to see quick progression with it. This doesn't last very long though, as over the course of the game everything scales and leveling takes progressively longer and longer, and it just gets more and more tedious as it goes on. Dungeons have changed a considerable amount from the first game, being much more linear this time. Less empty, wide open areas with nothing in them and awkward routes, and more direct pathways with branching paths that often lead to optional content like one or two chests, much more like a traditional JRPG, something you'd see today. I definitely like these changes, and exploring is a lot more natural and incentivized since you might find a chest with an actually decent item in it this time, instead of empty chests, chests with 4 gold, or nothing at all. The part that ruins these dungeons and makes them so notoriously bad is the trapdoors. These infamous doors spawn you in the middle of an empty room with an extremely high encounter rate, and force the player to fight their way out. They're simply there just to waste the player's time and be the absolute worst and most annoying idea ever. The worst part about these is that they're everywhere, sometimes even multiple times in the same dungeon or on the same floor. These ruin the dungeon experience entirely, as it turns every door into a big guessing game to progress. Take them out, and I would argue that the dungeons here are better than the first games in nearly every way. While there may still be lots of dead-end paths, it's easy enough to just backtrack a bit and continue exploring. No more enemies being scripted to specific tiles that you might accidentally walk back on and force you to fight the boss again. These dungeons do suck, but with some slight tweaks they could be pretty good. To go with the larger story focus, Final Fantasy II implements the learn and ask mechanic. You talk to NPCs and sometimes they'll speak in a red text, indicating that they have a new term for you to learn. Take it from them and then use that term anywhere, usually unlocking new dialogue and progressing the story from other NPCs. I like this mechanic in theory. It's like a primitive form of the choice-based dialogue that many modern games utilize, but it honestly makes the game really, really tedious in its execution. Knowing what terms go where and having story progress locked behind it can be a major pain, and without a guide, it mostly just turns into a game of trial and error, just using terms over and over on any NPC you can find that might help you. Sometimes progress is even halted behind asking the same NPC the term that you just learned from them, because of course you would think to ask the exact same thing that you just learned. Why wouldn't you? Final Fantasy II sucks, but not in the way that the first games did. FF1's main issue is just that it's old, and it's kind of archaic in a lot of areas, while 2 suffers from genuinely bad game design. While I can appreciate how ambitious some of the ideas here are, and there are portions that are legitimately better than the first game, Final Fantasy II just falls flat in too many ways, and it's just too tedious all around to enjoy. If you notice that my footage of this is much less varied than the first game, that's because I played about 2 hours worth of the game and I quit because it was so miserable, I didn't want to play this game again. Do not play this game unless you like the historical aspect of it, or you want to play every game in the series like I did. It should really say a lot that when the most interesting thing that happens in this game is that guys speak beaver. Closing out the NES era comes Final Fantasy III. It's the first game in the series that feels like a real video game. The best thing I can say about this game is that the development team clearly learned a lot from the previous 2 games, both what worked and what didn't work. Taking a back-to-basics approach, FF3 decided to return to the much better formula that the first game had established. Gone are the larger plot, role-playing elements, and the characters that don't really go anywhere, and returning are the generic characters, the simple but effective plot, and a bigger focus on adventuring and exploring all the locations of the world. The tedious level progression system of FF2 has been removed in favor of the basic XP system that the first game had, that actually worked pretty well. For this, I chose to play the Pixel Remaster version. I know most people tend to prefer the 3D remake on the DS, and I will be playing that eventually, but for now, I wanted to get as close to the original experience as possible. As I mentioned before, Final Fantasy III decides to take a lot from Final Fantasy I's notebook. Not everything is the same as FF1 though. There are a few key differences, namely being the magic system. Just like before, you select a limited number of spells to assign to slots per spell level. The difference this time is that you no longer have MP, instead having a limited number of spell uses per level, similar to something like D&D. You can also unequip and re-equip spells as needed. I'm a little mixed on this system. While I do like being able to equip and unequip magic as needed, as I think it helps a lot with the systems in this game, which we'll get into later, I do prefer just having a straight MP meter and determining how much I have from there and keeping track of all that, as opposed to spell slots. Not everything from FF2 was scrapped, however, as the dungeon designs continued to progress. Mixing the open areas and long hallways of the previous games allows for these dungeons to feel a lot more natural, like they were deliberately designed for use by people or creatures in universe. There are a ton of hidden paths leading to treasure, and it really incentivizes the player to explore every nook and cranny. I really do like the dungeons in this game. There are still some issues, but overall these are the best by far of the three. The main gameplay mechanic this time is the job system, where your party members can choose a class to specialize in and switch to another as needed. I'm sure I don't need to talk about it too much, as this became one of the most reused formats for JRPGs out there, and with good reason, because the job system rules. I love the job system. Being able to customize your party to whatever playstyle you want, whenever you want, feels so freeing, and it really opens up the game to different playstyles and much more replayability. You can mostly tackle any encounter however you see fit. There are some slight issues with the system in this game specifically, however, as you level jobs individually per character. This means that when you switch jobs, you'll start back at level 1 and have access to only the basic abilities that it offers. This isn't the biggest issue, as your characters do gain levels and base stats will increase regardless of the chosen job, but it does make your party feel pretty weak for way too long as you grind these other jobs back up to the level that you were at with others. Now you're probably wondering, well, why don't you just stick to one job for each character for pretty much the entire game? And that's a fairly good question. Beyond just being boring and making the game feel like a rehash of the ideas of Final Fantasy I, the problem extends with this game's use of gimmick areas and fights. All Final Fantasy games, and to a further extent, almost all JRPGs, have gimmicks. I actually enjoy them for the most part, as they can be a fun way to mix up gameplay and keep it from getting stale, but this game doesn't do them very well. While you don't necessarily have to switch job for certain bosses or areas, the game makes it apparently clear that it has certain classes in mind that you should use to do these encounters. The biggest example that comes to my mind to showcase this is the mini dungeon. You have to use the magic mini on your party to make them all small so they can fit in this tiny village and progress to the next area. You're basically forced to utilize magic at this point because your team is too small to do physical damage to any enemies you encounter. This puts a massive strain on any characters you built as physical fighters to this point, which is pretty easy because there's a lot of physical damage classes, as they can be switched to classes that deal magic, but they'll be super weak because they haven't leveled the job or got access to better spells. In concept, I really like these ideas since they make the player think and utilize the job system, but in execution, it's just not very fun to have to deal with. I haven't talked about the story much because it doesn't really matter. Like I said before, the plot takes a backseat in this game and it doesn't really stick out too much, just like the first game. The story starts with a short intro describing the state of the world. Catastrophe is hit, with monsters appearing and natural disasters occurring, causing the crystals that power the world to disappear. 4 orphans explore a newly made cave and fall into a hole there, getting lost and needing to find their way out. The group stumble upon a crystal of wind, which informs them that they have been chosen to be the new warriors of light, and bestows upon them its blessing, granting them the power to fight against the darkness enveloping the world. The four leave their hometown and begin their journey to find all the crystals and end the darkness. In contrast to the first two games, I find this plot and the intro as a whole to be the weakest by far. It's simple, but it's too overly simple to where it's no longer very engaging. In Final Fantasy I, you instantly have a main villain, and you get to familiarize yourself with him and the world. Your goal throughout the entire game is always, I gotta stop Garland, I gotta stop Chaos. Final Fantasy II has an emotional pull, with the protagonist's home being terrorized by the Empire, so you quickly empathize with their desire to fight back. In Final Fantasy III, the game just kind of has a vague go beat darkness plot, and it doesn't really set up much at all. I don't know the darkness, I really don't know, well, the effects that it's having on the world, and the concept of darkness is kind of bloated. The idea of 4 random orphans being the chosen warriors is pretty cool though. The plot never really moves anywhere beyond this for the entirety of the game. It has some decent subplots and side characters like Desh and Sid, but the main plot never really progresses past find the crystals and beat darkness. The main villain is a guy named Zand, who you never see or hear anything about unless it's something bad happening and someone will exclaim that it's his fault. Even the writers themselves don't really care about Zand because once he shows up, he's immediately sidelined for the Cloud of Darkness, a villain that shows up for about 30 minutes total in the entire game, but is somehow still way more memorable than Zand. It's been a while since I fully played through the game, so I had to look up the main story beats to refresh myself, because most of it is very forgetful. This doesn't mean bad per se, but it's definitely less effective than FF1's plot since this game is longer and it doesn't start as strong to begin with. All this being said, I still enjoyed this game a decent amount, and it's easily the best of the series on the NES. Exploration is fun, finding all the hidden stuff and doing side content is pretty entertaining, and the combat is the best of the series by far. While there were issues with the game, nothing was so egregious that it made me outright hate anything. The Pixel Remaster version of this game is great, as the modern conveniences remove some of the tedium and alleviates the issues with areas like the Crystal Tower that are infamously bad. It makes them not completely suck anymore. It's awesome. I struggled to write about this game because while it has its positives and its negatives, neither deviate from the standard that much. It's a very simple game, right down to the middle. If you've played a turn-based JRPG, it's probably something like this game. It's not as weird as FF1, and it's not as bad as FF2, so there really isn't much for me to make a super strong opinion about. Overall, it's just a decent game that I think it's worthwhile playing. And that covers my thoughts on the first 3 Final Fantasy games, originally on the NES. Overall, they aren't very good, especially by modern standards, but as I've mentioned before, they're pretty interesting pieces of gaming and JRPG history. Join me next time when I cover Final Fantasy IV, 5, and 6 for the Super Nintendo. Spoiler alert, I think that will be much more entertaining, and I'll have a lot more to talk about there, because I like those games much more than these. If you stuck with me this far, thank you very much for watching.